Hello, and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folktales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, and today, in honor of the holiday season, we are going to talk about the highly controversial figure, Jesus Christ, aka our boy Yeshua from Philistine. Let's talk about it. I think there are so many layers of our current society that are so deeply affected by this character, this man that we now know as Jesus Christ. His legacy and his life was revolutionary at the time of when he was alive. But I think what is so fascinating about Jesus and his legacy is that if he were to be alive today, he would still be considered radical and still very possibly would be killed by whichever government, whichever country he was born into. And I mean this with all of the empathy in my heart that I believe that most Christians are not real Christians. And I think I'll extend that further. I think many people who subscribe to large religions are often not true disciples of whatever prophet or belief system. Most people end up becoming cult members and are guided more by the society, the hierarchy of whichever culture or religious group that they're subscribed to. That's just my hot take, babe. Take it or leave it. We have so much to cover, and so I want to hop right into it. First and foremost, we need to talk about Palestine and we need to talk about the land of Palestine, which has been seized and is now called Israel. It is important to address that in some of my notes, I will be talking about Israel. However, in the ancient context, Israel meant something a little bit different. Now, in the Bible, of course, the Israelites referred to the people of the Old Testament, the ancient ancestors of the Jewish people. They often were referred to as the Israelites in the Old Testament. They were allegedly slaves of the Egyptians, okay? So, in the Bible, the term Israel is used in a few contexts. One of them is referring to a specific person, a god named Israel who later became known as Jacob. And this was the one who struggles with God. There's a story of the Bible after he wrestles God, and Jacob becomes named Israel, the one who struggles with God. Israel can also refer to a people or a nation, essentially the descendants of Jacob that became the 12 tribes of Israel, often called the children of Israel or the Israelites. And also, Israel refers to the geographical region promised to Abraham's descendants, sometimes called the land of Israel, though it was also known as Canaan. And this is worth talking about because the children of Abraham referred to all Abrahamic religions, okay? This refers to the Jewish people, the Christian people, and the people of Islam, okay? Interestingly, Israel can also refer to the kingdoms of Judea. After King Solomon, this unified kingdom split into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, both descendants of Jacob's lineage. Okay, so I just want to be clear. There is a distinction between the ancient referral to Israel, and now when we say Israel, we're referring to an actual state, a country that is recognized in the UN. It is recognized globally as a country. This is an important distinction to make. I want to be very clear that I am anti-colonization. I am anti-genocide. I do believe all people reserve the right to exist, reserve the right to live a healthy and safe life, and reserve the right to practice any religion they deem fit. However, if people are murdering each other, if people are seizing and taking land, I'm not for this. This transcends whatever denomination, whatever identity a person has. This goes without saying. Okay? What I find so fascinating is this idea of history repeating itself. It seems as if the story of Jesus or the story of Yeshua is more relevant today than ever before. And it seems as if humanity is in a shared dream, almost like Groundhog Day, that is repeating itself again and again and again until we are able to learn the lesson. Learn whatever lesson it is we need to learn to break the cycle. So let's get into the details, babe. Jesus, as we know it, people think that he was born around the year zero, right? Right now it's the year 2025. It's almost 2026. Why? Literally, the years that we have are based off of the birth of Jesus. Fun fact, most likely Jesus was not born in the year zero. It is believed that he was born between the year 3 and 7, give or take. No one really knows. So, there was a lot happening during the birth of Jesus. Around this time, the Roman world was a superpower. They controlled much of the Mediterranean, and they were building roads, they were taxing people, and they had a lot of military control. And there was a lot of, the borders of Rome were often changing. But during the time of Jesus's birth, the area that we now know as the Levant, or in the ancient world, the land of Canaan, this would be Syria, Palestine, what is now known as Israel. These areas were under control of Rome. Egypt was also under control of Rome during some of these periods. This was off and on, and Rome's borders were massive. Judea and Palestine were very strategic to Rome because of its position between Syria and Egypt, right? They wanted this land because it was a huge trade route between Syria and Egypt. And they really, really wanted to have a peaceful area there. They did not want any kind of uprising. It was important for them to have that area on lock, under control. So, interestingly, even though it was under Roman control, they would often appoint a local king of Judea to keep the people peaceful. Really, what was happening is a lot of the population in this area were Jewish at the time. And so, by having a Jewish king, they believed it would keep the people in higher spirits because they had someone they could report to, a monarch that they felt that they could trust. So, Herod the Great was the king around the birth of Jesus. Like I mentioned, he was backed by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was in control of this area, which was often known as Judea. But King Herod the Great was kind of like the local ruler. He is associated with the birth narrative in the book of Matthew. After Herod the Great, parts of the region were governed by his sons, known as Herod Antipas, and who was the king and, well, what they called the Tetrarch of Galilee. And he became a key political figure during the ministry of Jesus's adulthood and eventually the execution of John the Baptist. Now, we're going to get there. I'm just kind of giving you some context. Don't worry. I'm going to fill all of you in. So, during this time, there were many Jewish people in this area of the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and there was a strong hope and wish for deliverance because even though they had a king, a placeholder king who was Jewish, they were under military rule. They were under military occupation. And I mean, again, just listen to the similarities of what's happening now. There's people in this area under military occupation and dreaming and hoping for freedom, for deliverance. And the other thing that's important to remember is that during this time, the most commonly practiced religion was Zoroastrianism. And I think this is something that gets really misconstrued, especially as someone who was raised in the West. I was raised in the United States. Our view of the ancient world is very centered around Rome and Greece. Obviously, this is a little problematic, but just to give the West the benefit of the doubt, I think it's because it's more relatable. We see these people as white or as a proximity to white. So often the Western world relates to Rome and Greece. However, Rome and Greece were new iterations and westernized adaptations of Eastern culture, which was much older and much more advanced and much more developed. So, Zoroastrianism during the birth of Jesus was point blank the most practiced religion. If you have not listened, I have a full episode on Zoroastrianism I highly recommend. But it emerged in the Iranian plateau and it started spreading across the world. It was considered to be one of the biggest and first monotheistic religions, and it was very simple and centered around this idea of a cosmic lightness and a cosmic darkness that are in constant battle with each other. And that a person, a human, gets to make the choice if they want to dedicate their life to light or dedicate their life to darkness. And usually, if you are on autopilot and not making a conscious decision without realizing it, you will participate in the growing of darkness. Whereas to to help and aid in the growth of light takes a conscious decision. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the people, the priests of Zoroastrianism were known as Magi, and they were considered some of the highest educated people on the planet. They were studying math, astrology, astronomy, sciences. They were considered alchemists. And regardless of people's religion at the time, these magi were considered some of the highest educated people on the planet and were often hired as advisors or wise men in other parts of the world. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so one thing I do really want to talk about is when we're talking about the story of Jesus, these are accounts written in the Bible. And when we say the Bible, there's multiple Bibles, right? Because often the Bible that when we speak of the Bible, we're thinking of the Bible that the Roman Empire adopted, which is a translation of one of the oldest New Testaments, which was a Greek text. However, the oldest Christian texts, which we consider the New Testament, were written in both Greek, Ethiopian, and Coptic Egyptian. These are the oldest scriptures. And then, of course, other scriptures started being written in places like Armenia, etc. But this is important to remember because when we're hearing about Jesus, we're hearing an account from a disciple who often was telling a story, and then someone would write that down in their language. So we're playing a game of telephone, which is already diluted. Even in the oldest scriptures, it's diluted, and then it's getting more diluted over time. So there are two major accounts of the birth of Jesus, one in the book of Matthew and one in the book of Luke. And to be clear, most of what I'm going to be reporting on is from the Greek version of the Bible. This is one in part because this is the Bible that is most likely referenced, especially in the Western world. Um, but I do think this is another nuance to remember. Greece, out of the places I mentioned, which are Ethiopia, Egypt, and Greece, Greece is arguably the farthest away from where Jesus was born. And It makes you think about the integrity of the information. Whichever disciple traveled into that part of the world and shared their story, how well would that have traveled and been translated? Okay, so in Luke's version of the Bible, Luke frames the birth of Jesus around travel to Bethlehem. According to him, Jesus was born in humble conditions in a manger, and that shepherds are the first visitors to the birth of Jesus. And Luke includes poetic songs, such as Mary's praise and Zechariah's prophecy. Whereas in the book of Matthew, this emphasizes the story of King Herod, the Magi, and the prophecy. Matthew frames the birth around a royal threat, a fulfillment of scripture, and political violence, and this allegedly newborn king that creates panic in the capital and triggers the fear of King Herod. Okay, so I just wanted to preface before we get into the story that these are actually two accounts that are often fused together. And this is an important context to remember. Jesus had 12 disciples and also many other followers. And so the stories and the scriptures that we're reading about him are a patchwork of many people's perception of him and also the lore of him. It almost became a tall tale, right? Okay, but in a nutshell, the story goes that there was a woman named Mary and a carpenter named, what's his name again? Oh no. I was on a roll. I'm on the spot, you guys. What was his name again? Joseph. Okay, I'm not crazy. That's what I thought. Okay, we have Joseph and we have Mary. According to the legend, Mary became pregnant with an immaculate conception. And pause. This is a very important point that I want to speak of. The interpretation of this immaculate conception is debated, especially because the specific wording of this could have been misinterpreted. One, that it was not necessarily immaculate at all, but two, some belief systems think that it was mistranslated and that Mary herself was an immaculate conception and came from an ancient line of women, of sorceresses. Now, regardless, let's stick to the meat of the story. Mary becomes pregnant, and before she gives birth, there is a prophecy that is predicted by these men known as the Magi. They are considered visitors in the kingdom of Judea, and they are considered wise men, astrologers, priests of Zoroastrianism, and they were visiting the court of King Herod. Allegedly, they see a star, and quote, when it rose, and I'm sorry, wait, the quote is, "We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." So, these wise men claim that there is a star rising and that there will be a new king of Judea. There will be a revolution of sorts. And so King Herod consults religious authorities about this prophecy that there will be a new king of Judea. And he asks them, where will this new king be born? And they reply, Bethlehem, which is in the ancient city of Jerusalem. And so King Herod asks them to go into Bethlehem and to search for this new baby and to report back to him. And after a few days, they do not return. And so King Herod decides, he decrees an order for all baby boys who are 2 years old and younger should be killed so that the prophecy does not fulfill itself. Let's take a quick break. Hi, it's me, Annabelle. And if you've made it this far, I appreciate you so much. please like and subscribe my channel, my page. I have so many kinds of content and I'm working on new kinds. You may be listening to me just through my podcast or through YouTube. You should check out my YouTube if you're not watching or listening to me there. I have meditation videos. I have yoga videos coming soon. I have my full length podcast. I'm doing short episodes. I'm doing shorts, and soon I'm going to be having listener episodes. So, like, subscribe. Thanks, babe. Love you. So, we are now at the point where Mary is getting ready to give birth. And according to the scriptures, King Herod had already given his decree that baby boys under the age of 2 be killed. And so this is a big reason why Jesus was born in secret. And according to legend, they went to Egypt after his birth to hide him, to avoid the persecution. What I do think is interesting is this story of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It reminds me of Oedipus, this idea that a king hears a prophecy and orders the death of a child to avoid losing his throne. Um, and I think that there is something important to note here. I personally believe that Jesus or Yeshua was a real person, but I do wonder the integrity of some of these details. Um, And I wonder how much of them are true and what details could be missing. And really, what I mean by that is yes, we're hearing about this prophecy that the king doesn't want to be overthrown. But I'm wondering what layers could be missing, such as colorism, such as racism. According to a lot of religious scholars, they believe that Jesus and his parents were a part of a nomadic tribe of Jewish people, people who were indigenous to the land and were not living in cities. They were living nomadically in tribes. And I think this is an important layer to think about because during the occupation of a Roman rule, people who are still living with the indigenous way of life, living in nomadic tribes, living outside the city, are impossible to control. And these are people that you don't really want there. They pose a threat to the imperialism. And I think this is a really, 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 really important layer that is often missed. That the persecution of Jesus, even before he became an adult, could be so layered and so much bigger than him just being a baby, a part of a prophecy. It could also be the race of people that he comes from and the culture of people that he comes from. One thing I think is really interesting that is worth mentioning is that when I was traveling through India, I did meet people who are Syrian Roman Catholic. These people they live in Kerala, which is a very small state on the southern west coast of India, and they claim to be descendants of some of the original disciples of Jesus. According to them, some of Jesus's disciples went into southern India and started sharing the teachings of Jesus, and some of these people who are direct descendants of these people have been Christian longer than the caste system has existed. So they've been Christian for over 2,000 years. And one thing I found really interesting when I was speaking to people in India about Christianity is their perspective. A lot of them were telling me, like, oh, everyone knows that Jesus spent his teenage years in India. They said that um, because he came from a nomadic people that he and Mary and Joseph traveled all around the world but spent a long time in India, and Jesus learned from the aesthetics in India. And also, according to them, they believe that Jesus went back to India after he was resurrected. Now, this is alleged, and this is the perspective of the people in India. However, when they shared that to me, I will say something about that resonated because a lot of the beliefs and teachings have a touch that does feel like Eastern philosophy. There's a piece of it that almost feels Hindu or Buddhist. And I found that to be a really refreshing and interesting perspective that so many people in India were telling me, like, yes, don't you know? Christianity is just Hinduism. And I have mentioned that before in older episodes, but it's worth mentioning again. So, as the story goes, as we know, Mary goes into labor. They have no place to stay. They find a manger. They rent it from an innkeeper, and they're in this little manger in a little barn. And she gives birth next to all the animals, this baby boy. They're visited by shepherds, and they're visited by the three magi, these three priests of Zoroastrianism who foretold his birth. And thus is the iconic birth of the baby Yeshua in Bethlehem. So, this sets the stage for our iconic prophet. Now, we do not know almost anything about the childhood of Jesus. Um, but what we do know is that really big things were happening in this part of the world, specifically in Judea and Egypt, where many people believed that Jesus was raised in Egypt. It's possible he was raised in India. We don't really know anything. But one thing that is important to note is that military control of this part of the world was very strict, and it was growing in strictness. And there was also a movement of certain individuals that were living a completely alternative lifestyle. They were living out in nature. And this kind of does remind me of the story of Buddha, these ascetics who are living by themselves, living in nature, and contemplating the meaning of life and contemplating what true connection with God or the creator of the universe really was. And these people were deemed as anti-establishment. They were deemed as threat to imperialism and threat to colonization. And so there was a growing tension that was possibly framed as religious belief, but it was actually truly about allegiance to the colonizer, allegiance to the emperor, or a traitor to the emperor. Okay? So, um, the name Jesus, there's so much to cover. I feel like I'm jumping around everywhere, but I need to keep you on your toes. We're using the name Jesus. His name was not really Jesus. Most likely his name was Yeshua, which is in the modern world often known as Joshua. And Jesus became used during the Greek renderings of the scriptures. And obviously now we are widely accepting this word Jesus. Everyone is using the word Jesus, but his name was not Jesus. One other thing I want to mention is that this image of Jesus that we most often picture in our minds are European renderings of him, and some of which were rendered after Western royalty's own family. For example, like the most classic crucifix that we think of, Jesus almost looks like a Spanish man. It's because he's literally rendered after a Spanish king's son. And so I just want to reiterate that Jesus, or Yeshua, was indigenous to Palestine. He was a brown man, and he was descendant of a nomadic people. So these people had brown skin and curly hair. Okay, we are not talking about a white man. We're not talking about a Spanish man. We're not talking about a Roman man. We are talking about a Palestinian man, babe. Get it straight. Another thing that's important to think about is that Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. This was the language of his people and the language of the area. And there's an important distinction between Aramaic and Hebrew. Hebrew was not a spoken language in the ancient world. Hebrew was a language of the Jewish scriptures. It was reserved specifically for Jewish scriptures. It was not a daily language that was used. That became implemented when Israel became a state and decided to make Hebrew its language. But before that time, Hebrew was not used as a colloquial spoken language in any country. Aramaic was the language of the time. And like I also mentioned, the oldest known scriptures of the New Testament are in Greek, Ethiopian, and Coptic Egyptian. So I really want that to sink in about our perception of Jesus and how much can be altered through the context of changing of language and the misinterpretation of culture. So much goes into somebody's words and phrasing when there's the context of that language and the context of that culture. And so much can be misinterpreted or misunderstood without that cultural reference and the culture of that specific time period. So much can be lost in translation. So, how much do we really know about this man? Not much. Not much. Okay, so as Jesus is growing up, we don't know exactly where he is, but in Judea, in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, we have a prominent figure who is coming on the rise. He is a legendary child known as John the Baptist. John the Baptist is an icon. He was incredibly famous during this time. He was almost like a little Buddha. During the Roman military occupation, there was a lot of social tension around power, around purity, around law, land, taxation, identity, and religion. John is described as a prophet of the wilderness whose role was to prepare the way for what God had planned. In the book of Matthew, it frames John the Baptist as a man who prepares the way. Okay, this is like straight from the Bible. According to the book of Matthew, John the Baptist was preaching and literally baptizing people in nature. It wasn't actually really about any specific religion. He was baptizing people in rivers and lakes outside of the city. He was talking to all kinds of people. He was talking to poor people, rich people, military people. People were coming to seek audience with him and to get advice from him. He was incredibly connected to nature. And he believed that nature was purification. He used language that aimed at religious elites and basically put them on blast. He called them quote the brood of vipers. He warned people of the wrath and greed of the wealthy people and people who were parading around as priests and religious prophets as actual leaders of exploitation and imperial control. He would talk to tax collectors and tell them to stop exploiting people and to take only what is required. He would talk to soldiers and ask them to stop intimidating and blackmailing people and be content with what they are paid by their governments. John the Baptist was a revolutionary at the time and, in a way, created the stage for Jesus. He was living his life outside of the context of social hierarchies and religious hierarchies. And he was putting church, he deemed that the most sacred place was the wilderness. He believed that equality was truly a moral and natural imperative. This is revolutionary. It is said that at one point, Jesus found John the Baptist and asked to be baptized. And according to the scriptures, John the Baptist says something along the lines of, "Why should I baptize you when you should be the one baptizing me?" And there's this symbolism of the clouds parting and it being this heavenly and unbelievable event. I don't know if I fully believe that. I I believe that John the Baptist was really walking the walk. He was really out there communing with nature, living in the forest, living a life of a monk, and it inspired Jesus and they became peers. But that's just my hot opinion. Now, unsurprisingly, John the Baptist ended up becoming a target of the Roman Empire. He was considered a threat to imperial power because he was convincing people to be libertarian. He was convincing people to drop everything and to worship nature and to be fair and kind to one another. And so, as his followers grew and more people were being baptized by him and going to live in the wilderness, he became a target of the Roman Empire and eventually he was murdered. Interestingly, they in the Gospel of John, there is a quote that says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." I have heard these Christian songs and I did not realize it referred to John the Baptist. I think what I find so ironic and silly about this is that Christianity is built on these beliefs of fairness and kindness, respect for nature, respect for all living people, respect for all living things, anti-imperialism, anti-control. And yet Christianity has become imperial. It has become about control. It has become about taxation. And I find it so interesting that these iconic figures, these figures that are Christianity, John the Baptist and Jesus, they are who created Christianity, are would still be considered radical. So many Christians, especially the Christians who are famous or putting themselves out there as authorities of Christianity, are the very opposite of what John the Baptist and Jesus talk about and preach about. Am I right or am I wrong? I'm right. Okay, so Jesus and John the Baptist, a really big part of their teachings were really about the idea that nature itself was the landscape of learning, was the landscape of God. That synagogues, temples, churches, these were not real places of worship. It was the land. And the reputation of both John the Baptist and Jesus was through spreading healing, exorcisms, speaking in parables and poems, and the idea of fellowship amongst all people. Jesus forgave the sins of everyone, and he healed on the Sabbath, and he would eat with everyone, even the wrong people. He would eat with people deemed unworthy. And this really started a huge movement, especially after John the Baptist was killed by the Roman Empire. This left an opening, a void. Jesus was filling the hole that was left by John the Baptist. And his style was much more approachable for larger crowds because he was starting to speak in narrative storytelling, in parables and poems. And this became almost a lecture style of teaching, which really created a large following. Hmm. This became most powerful in the area of Galilee. Jesus started teaching around villages, around the shores of lakes, not in temples. He was traveling around and he would encounter fishermen, some which became some of his disciples, such as Simon, Andrew, James, and John. He would invite them in a very simple way. He would just say, "Follow me." People would leave their lives behind. They would leave behind their boats, their nets, their livelihoods, not simply because of their curiosity, but because they were interested in reorienting their lives. People were very aware that their lives were under control. everything they did was being taxed. Everything they did was under the control of a military, and they were seeking something more profound. They were seeking freedom. And so this movement, this idea of traveling, almost like a Confucius, created a movement so much bigger because it was daring to ask, how do I respond in a life, in a world that is controlled under a hierarchy, under a military, under a fascist regime? Let's take a quick break. Are you a fan of the podcast and want everyone to know? Well, guess what? We have merch live. There are sweatshirts, t-shirts, tank tops, water bottles, stickers, all kinds of things. There's also some other like random fun things of my personal art. But why not get a tote bag, a tumbler, and a hoodie to tell the world that you listen to the pod? Check it out. There's a link in the description of this video and a link in the description of my podcast and channel. Check me out, babe. So, Jesus is becoming more popular. He is traveling the lands. He is gaining more disciples. Finally, a tax collector known as Matthew joins him. Political radicals are joining him, and skeptics. His group of disciples is socially mixed, it's economically unstable, and it is ideologically diverse. This is an all is welcome kind of buffet. And that is what made his major disciples that we think of so iconic in a way, is that there were people of all walks of life and people of varying degrees of belief in what he was saying. His 12 core disciples that we talk of, these are the iconic ones, is Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Thomas, James, Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas. Now, some of them go by different names. So, for example, Peter is sometimes known as Simon, um, etc. I'm not going to go through all of them. Philip is sometimes known as Bartholomew. It's kind of confusing. There's so much information. Let's keep it simple. But the reason why some of them go by different names is because these scriptures were written down by different cultures. So some of these names are reinterpretations of specific cultures. And again, this is so important to remember. A lot of this is alleged, and a lot of this has become a tall tale because these scriptures were written a few years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years after Jesus died. And so there's so much liberty that was taken into account as they were being written, right? Okay. So let's talk about some of the iconic teachings and really the meat of what is written from Jesus's teachings, which is the Sermon on the Mount. So, during the early ministries of Jesus, a really big part of his day-to-day life was healing people, teaching people, but also growing crowds. We've all heard about miracles that Jesus was doing, and according to the scriptures, he was really doing this. He would heal people of diseases. He would take on their sicknesses and then heal himself from them. And he was doing these miracles and people were amazed. And he was kind. He judged no one. He didn't judge the oppressors or the oppressed. So he was traveling through the area known as Galilee. He was traveling through villages and rural areas. He would heal the stick. He would heal the sick, and he would also talk to the people who were outcasted, and he would bring them back into society. He would forgive people for their sins, and he would speak in metaphors and parables. He would eat with everyone, including the sinners. And more people became fascinated by him and started following him around. But because of that, because he grew more followers, he also grew a bigger audience of opposition. Many people did not like what he was doing. And what's fascinating is that there was two major parties of people who did not like him, one of which were religious leaders, specifically leaders in the area who were Jewish rabbis. They did not like what Jesus was doing because they felt like it undermined their authority. And part of what he was preaching was not to go to synagogues and to have a connection with nature. Also, unsurprisingly, Rome and the people who were um, loyal to Rome did not like what he was doing because it was considered radical and anti-establishment. So, I'm not sure if you realize, but not that much in the Bible really does talk about Jesus. There's not as much as you would think. But the most iconic piece of the Bible is the Sermon on the Mount. And this is a sermon that he gave that is very iconic and really sums up the essence of his teachings. He gathers his disciples and delivers what becomes this iconic speech that is kind of the basis of what now Christianity is supposed to be. And this is really a speech of a radical ethical charter. He blesses the poor, he blesses the meek, and he blesses the persecuted. He intensifies the law. He says that anger itself becomes a seed to murder. He says that lust becomes a seed to adultery, and that love extends even to enemies. He was making it impossible to fake religion. He was being clear that every single person is deserving of love and that there is no context where hate and anger or lust is appropriate. And I think that's very, very, very crucial. He also speaks on this idea of being the child of God and that everyone is a child of God. And what God is the creator of all things. Now, I think this is very radical and something important to remember because obviously, as time went on, then Jesus became deemed as the only child of God, this like God being reincarnated as a human. And I think that was divisively created to take away the power of individuals. Because at no point does Jesus actually say anything along the lines of him being more powerful than anyone else. His teachings were very much based in the idea that the power of God, the power of the creator of the universe, lives within us all. It doesn't matter who you are, if you are rich or poor, or a sinner or pure, that this ability lives within us, and that at any point you can be forgiven for your wrongdoings and ascend. I mean, come on, people. I mean, we just love this. We love this. There's an amazing film called Stigmata, and I feel like I've talked about this before, but you need to watch it. And in the movie Stigmata, they do talk about scriptures, the ancient scriptures that were found that have not been like fully released or deemed um what's the word? Basically, the Vatican has deemed them to be untrue, but there are some unofficial scriptures um, where Jesus talks about that you can find God in all things, under a stone, under a plank of wood, and that God lives within everything, including you. And so, of course, understandably, religious leaders and political leaders were hating this. People were getting excited. People were feeling powerful. People were feeling hope and disconnecting from society and connecting with nature. They couldn't have this. This is an area under military occupation, people. So, as time goes on, there is escalation and conflict with authorities. We all knew this was going to happen. Jesus' influence is growing, and so is his scrutiny. He's forgiving sins without priestly authority, right? He's not a real priest, he's not a real rabbi. He's healing people on the Sabbath, which is supposed to be the day of rest. And he's challenging temple economics. He's telling people to stop donating money to temples and synagogues. And he's calling religious leaders hypocrites. Eventually, Jesus travels to Jerusalem during Passover, and this is the most politically volatile time of the year. And he is now entering the gates of Jerusalem, entering the gates of the capital. He's been traveling in the wilderness and growing an audience there. He's become infamous, but now he has entered the gates of Jerusalem, and now he is on display. He is a target. Crowds are drawn to him, and they specifically want healing and they want teaching. There is so much local religious tension. People are disputing over authority, over purity, over the Sabbath, over the symbolism of temples and the integrity of temples and the integrity of synagogues. This idea that any kingdom is occupied land. This idea of occupation, of colonization, that regardless of who claims to be in charge of an area, that itself is occupation and that itself is colonization. And that is radical, right? So really, even if the Rome wasn't occupying this part of the world, that any leader, any king, any government would be occupying. It would be an occupation. And I have to say, I do fully agree. I I agree with everything that's happening here. I'm honestly living. We love Yeshua. He's our boy. Of course, the king of Judea, who at the time was Antipas, the son of King Herod the Great, is not liking this, right? John the Baptist is already dead. They are killing people like this. This is not cool. This is creating an uprising that they are terrified of having, because let me remind you, this area of the Mediterranean is placed between Syria and Egypt, two very powerful places, and they need to have the area in between free for trade routes, etc. So they do not want any kind of turmoil or any kind of uprising. This is crucial. So, as Jesus enters Jerusalem, the city crowds and they're shouting language at him about being a Messiah, both excited and also hateful. People are just they're buzzing about this idea that there could be this new Messiah, and I mean, there's crowds of people awaiting him in Jerusalem. It is very public. It is symbolic, and it is deemed dangerous. And there is an incident at a temple. Jesus disrupts commerce in the temple precincts. And this is not a random occurrence. This is a direct challenge to religious authority. He is purposely challenging these religious leaders and calling them hypocrites. He's calling them corrupt. And specifically for their economic exploitation, for charging people money to be religious and using that money for their own gain. And this also brings to attention the alliance that was created through local temples and local synagogues to the Roman Empire. He is talking about that these men who are claiming to be religious are actually being paid out by the Roman Empire to control people. Fucking, and how fucking fascinating that now Rome to this day is using Jesus as their mascot to control people's beliefs. I mean, this is the PR move of a lifetime. It's this is just so fascinating to me that the very man who is calling out corruption of religious leaders controlling people and basically having them show allegiance to an imperial power, the very man calling that out who was murdered for it is now the mascot for imperial control. Unbelievable. So, very quickly after his arrival in Jerusalem, multiple people are gunning for his death. They need to kill him. Both religious leaders and military leaders, they cannot have Jesus. They are trying to end his life. So this leads us to our pinnacle moment, this moment that we know as the Last Supper. This happens during Passion Week. And essentially the Last Supper, as most of us know, is this last meal that Jesus shares with his disciples during the season of Passover. He allegedly speaks about betrayal and interprets his impending death through the symbolism of a meal, of breaking bread and sharing wine with even his enemies. So it alludes that he realized that his death was coming, that his death was inevitable. And this was a very intimate dinner and a very intimate farewell. According to his disciples, he was really saying goodbye the night before he was captured. It is said that after dinner, Jesus went into the garden to pray, and his disciples struggled to stay awake. According to the story, this is a moment of spiritual pressure, of loneliness and surrender, because according to the text, Jesus knew he was going to die. And most likely, according to the texts, his disciple Judas was the one who gave away Jesus's location to the Roman military officers. Now, if it was a disciple or not, I think doesn't matter. It was clearly someone. Someone knew where he was and was ready for him to die. That very night, Jesus was arrested and he was questioned by not only Jewish authorities, but also Roman authorities. The Roman concern was very obvious. Is this man a king? Is this man leading a revolution, leading a counter countercultural like Roman movement? And this is very important to understand because Rome doesn't crucify theologians. Rome doesn't crucify philosophers. Rome crucifies threat to their imperial power. And so they wanted to know if this man was really leading people. Because if people were showing allegiance to him and he was growing a movement, this was a direct threat to imperial power. Of course, we know why so many Jewish authorities were against Jesus and wanted him killed, because he was directly opposing their authority as leaders and really their job. Their job was to collect money from people who trusted them. So, of course, this leads to the iconic crucifixion of Jesus. Again, I think it's kind of creepy that Christianity decided to use the cross as the symbol of Christianity. The very symbol that crucified their prophet is now like the symbol of their religion. I think that's kind of dark and bizarre. However, as we all know, a crucifixion is a very gruesome and torturous death. It is where two planks of wood are assembled like a cross and somebody is nailed. They have a nail through each wrist and a nail through their ankles. Jesus is also depicted wearing a crown of thorns, and you are bleeding out and also experiencing excruciating pain as your body is bearing the weight of these nails that you are nailed to this cross. Imagine nails going through your wrist and you sagging, the weight of your body sagging and just being ripped. And usually would often take multiple days for you to die. It's horrific. It is horrific. And of course, in according to the Christian belief, they believe that Judas was definitely the one who sold them out. And there's something about that that is a very interesting and important part of the Christian ideology. This idea that not an outsider, not an enemy, but an actual friend of Jesus sold him out. And according to the true Christian beliefs, this is supposed to be a symbol of forgiveness. Jesus was never angry at Judas and he was never angry at the Romans. He forgave every person, even while on the cross. He experienced no resentment and no hatred, even in crucifixion. And so this is supposed to be a symbol of divinity, a symbol of kindness, that even in the worst of circumstances, he chooses empathy and compassion. I think sadly, as time has continued, the crucifixion is almost used as this idealism of like self-torture, that like torturing yourself is godliness and denial of pleasure is godliness. And I think it's quite the opposite. Um, of course, that's just what has happened over time, especially in the medieval era. I do, like I have said many times, I do consider our current era to be the post-medieval era. There is so much medieval belief and medieval, specifically European medieval modalities that we are still living out and living through without even realizing it. One of them being these ideals of what Christianity really is. And it's really has been led astray from what the meat of this movement was about, which is about radical kindness, radical connection with nature, and radical connection with self. Kindness under all circumstance, never anger, never hatred, never lust, not even just in a sexual way, like not wanting something to the point of taking it or exploiting it, of having an unbending kindness and compassion for all living things and a connection with nature. That is what Christianity was built on. And I think that has been completely lost. Let's take a quick break. This is your friendly reminder from your friend Annabelle that you are incredible. You are one of a kind. There is only one of you in this whole planet. Therefore, all of the things within you, the things that you see as your weaknesses, the things that you see as your strengths, they're your superpowers because you're the only one of you. You are supposed to be here right now. You're in the perfect place at the perfect time. What if you just believed in yourself? Like you literally got this. This is your reminder. Drink your water. Take care of yourself. Put the work into yourself. What if you really believed in yourself and you went for it? Why not? You got this, bitch. So, I could talk about this forever. There's so much to cover. Of course, we have heard about Mary Magdalene. I do want to talk about her, but I think she deserves her own episode. I've already been talking for an hour, so I want to stay on point. If there are other parts of this story that are very important to you that you want me to cover, please write in. But I do really want to touch on the legacy after Jesus. Now, really quick, actually, of course, after his crucifixion, after his death, he was put in a tomb. And it is said that days after he was buried in his tomb, they opened his tomb and his body was gone. And according to some disciples, he was still alive and still preaching. Um, Obviously, in more modern versions of the Bible, not a lot is talked about that. It's not really specified where he was or what he did. According to the people in India, he definitely just went to India and preached there. We technically don't know. Um, but his legacy started creating ripples through the ancient world. The first ever Christian church was built in Egypt just a few years after Jesus died. And it is said that his disciples went to all different parts of the ancient world, mostly to avoid Roman persecution. And this is where things get really interesting because, as I mentioned, Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, but the oldest versions of the Bible are not written in Aramaic. And I think that is very fascinating and very crucial to remember because we are hearing these stories. I mean, I'm speaking to you in English. The Bible verses that I'm referencing were written in English, which were most likely translated from the Latin version of the Bible, which were most likely translated from the Greek version of the Bible. So, as I mentioned, the oldest versions of the Bible are Greek, Ethiopian, and Coptic Egyptian. However, unsurprisingly, for many reasons, and dare I say, racist reasons, the Greek version is considered the base language of the New Testament. Okay, this is considered to be the canonical New Testament that we just consider the New Testament. This is known as the Codex Sinaiticus, and this was written in the fourth century. Fourth century. So this is 400 years after Jesus died. The reason why I mentioned that this feels a little racist to me is that there are allegedly manuscripts that are older, specifically the manuscripts written in Egypt and the manuscripts written in Ethiopia. They just aren't given specific dates, and this feels very loaded that they are not considered the original text. They seem older and they are closer to the birthplace of Jesus and where he was teaching. Just saying, right? So Obviously, it is important, though, to understand that this Codex Sinaiticus, which was the Greek Bible, was the Bible eventually borrowed by the Romans and translated. However, when Rome translated the Bible and made Christianity their major religion, they eliminated many parts of the Bible. They were deleting books, deleting phrases, etc., etc. In the Egyptian Bible, known as the Coptic Christian tradition, if you haven't listened to, I have an episode all about the Copts and the Coptic tradition. It is fascinating. A lot of people don't realize that the oldest Christian church in the world was built in Egypt and that they are some of the OG Christians. It's fascinating stuff. This version of the Bible preserves different variants of languages, specifically S- S- the Sadic and Bohadic dialects. So these are very specific dialects of the region of Judea, of ancient Palestine. And I think that is really interesting and important to realize that in the Egyptian Bible, they were preserving ancient dialects. So there could be a lot to uncover there. I wish I spoke those languages. I wish I could report more to you on those. Also, in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, um, this this version has more books of the Bible. There is the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the book of Maccabean. This basically has more books that are not listed in more modern versions of the Bible. And this is another thing that is like a whole world. I should do a whole episode on those. But this is a whole world of Christianity that is basically erased or not really considered valid by other parts of the Western world, which also feels like there's a lot of racism encoded into that. And a lot of course, as Rome made Christianity its religion, there was a lot of editing they did because, as we know, Rome used religion as a way to control people. And so there's so many layers of what the Bible turned into because it was used divisively to control people's beliefs. And just think about that. Think about the conquest of Europe. Think about Europe colonizing the Americas, Africa, so many indigenous cultures, and using Christianity as a means to do so. I'm here in Mexico right now, and there are churches on every corner. And I find that so fascinating. I'm not, like I said, I'm not anti-Christian. I just think it's so fascinating that a colonizer, a person building cities, a person cutting down forests, murdering people, enslaving people, genociding people, is doing that and also spreading the word of Jesus. It's hypocritical. It is the antithesis to the teachings of Jesus. And it's fascinating to me. And I think there's an element of the story of Jesus that they have repurposed. And I mentioned this earlier. This idea that Jesus is kind to everyone, but he also allowed himself to be killed. And I think that's the aspect that they teach people, like, be a good Christian and turn around and die. Instead of stand on your beliefs, travel into the wilderness, be kind to everyone. And how fascinating is it that the people bringing these scriptures are doing the exact opposite? It is wild. It is so, so, so wild. And even today, we're seeing this, how religion is being used as an excuse to deny people civil rights, to deny people safety, to deny people food, shelter, to deny people the right to get married. None of these things are actually Christian values. It's created by this prophet that they deem the creator of Christianity. His essence was about living in nature and seeing nature as your temple, seeing nature as your synagogue, and having your own relationship with the creator of the universe through kindness. Now, of course, the Bible finally gets translated into Latin. And this is known as the Vulgate. And this is in the late fourth century. Okay, so this is in the same century. The Bible is written in Greek in the fourth century. And then within the same 100 years, it is translated into Latin. And this translation is associated with Jerome, who was commissioned to revise the Latin gospel texts and later expanded it in scope. Hear that. It was translated, revised, and expanded. They added things that they wanted to add to control people. And that is a crucial understanding. If you are reading a Bible in English, it is 99% most likely from the Latin Vulgate version that was taken from the Greek version. So there's so much missing and so much that was revised. I think a great example of that is in Latin, in the Latin Bible, the word for God is dominus, which means master. It means master. That is phrasing that you would use in a slave and master dynamic, meaning that you are owned by God. God is your master. That is so different. Another really big example is that some linguists have said that this idea of the kingdom of God was most likely the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of enlightenment versus the kingdom of God. This idea that God is like some ruler in the sky, some master, versus God being a consciousness, God being actually heaven, God as a realm of consciousness. There's a completely different interpretation. I also mentioned too, in a earlier episode, that there is a very famous Jesus quote that if someone is to slap you, you turn the other cheek. And so this has often been interpreted as that if someone is to hit you, you're completely passive and you let them hit you again. What has been culturally lost from the context of that teaching was actually a little more nuanced. Because in the ancient world, the right hand was the hand that you used on a daily basis for writing, etc. Your left hand was used for wiping your ass. So you wouldn't use your left hand, you wouldn't shake hands with your left hand, you wouldn't be doing things with your left hand because it's dirty and it's specifically for wiping your ass. So when you slap someone, you slap them with your right hand. And then the reason why Jesus says turn the other cheek is so that you don't allow yourself to be backhanded. If somebody slaps you, you're basically set up for you to be backhanded. And being backhanded is the ultimate disgrace. And really, he's making an allegory. He's not really talking about somebody hitting you and then backhanding you. He's saying something deeper about not setting yourself up to be disrespected, not setting yourself up to be treated so poorly by people, to be making decisions where it is impossible for someone to truly disrespect you, to truly backhand you. It was really a teaching about self-respect. Does that make sense? Like these are nuances that we lose through time and through not understanding the cultural context, the context of the language, the time period, the society, everything. We have lost so much. I feel like that was the most brief overview, and it's already been an hour and 13 minutes. So I'll leave you with this. Our understanding, our world, our modern world we have built is very much built around Jesus Christ, especially the Western world. The Western world is very Christian. It is obsessed with Jesus and obsessed with Christianity. Regardless if you were raised Christian or not, there are symbols of Christianity everywhere. There are values of Christianity everywhere. And my question is, are these values truly Christian, or are they actually values of the Roman Empire? Are they values that the Roman Empire co-opted to control people? Do we really incorporate the teachings of Jesus into our daily life? Do we really honor him with our actions and our words? And how is it that even though his words or the interpretation of his words are written, you can read them in the Bible, even in these versions of the Bible that have been revised and translated multiple times over? How is it that even though you can read these words and read his teachings, people can still interpret them and justify violence and bigotry? I don't necessarily have the answer. I don't know how it is possible that someone can claim to be Christly, that they claim to worship Christ, and yet do things that are the antithesis of his teachings. But I think there's something to discover here within human society and human psychology. I think there's a deep sickness in human society, and it's old. This is thousands of years old. It's clear that it was happening during the time of Jesus, that people are blindly following imperial powers. They are blindly following a colonized machine. And it is keeping us from the real truth that our connection with the creator of the universe is right outside our door. It is in the trees, in the rivers, in the mountains, in the sky. That nature is our truest and closest connection to the kingdom of heaven. So, this is your reminder to spend more time in nature, trust your intuition, and be kind. Kindness is one of the greatest acts of rebellion. Truly, Jesus was killed for it. Kindness and love is the secret ingredient to what can change our world and grow a healthier society. That's my belief, at least. Ultimately, I find that Christian culture has really alienated me. I find it to be cult like and oppressive. But ultimately, the teachings of Jesus and the legacy of Jesus, I love it. I stand for it. I'm a huge fan. What do you think? Thank you so much for listening. I have so much appreciation for you. I know that you are a beautiful, kind person. Every human being is a beautiful, kind person to their core. Every human being deserves to be free and deserves the freedom to connect with nature and connect with the euphoria of what it means to be alive. I love you. I appreciate you. I wish you nothing but blessings. I'll catch you next time.